with the election of 1852. In this election, the Democrats surprised the nation by nominating the second dark horse president, a lawyer, a politician from the hills of New Hampshire. Our first dark horse president had been James K. Polk. He had showed up at the convention. This time we have our second dark horse president candidate, but he did not even show up at the election. Not the election, the convention. He had no intention of running for the presidency. Franklin Pierce, though handsome, was a weak and indecisive figure. He had served in the Mexican-American War as a result of a painful groin injury that caused him to fall off his horse. He was known as the fainting general. But he was enemyless because he had been inconspicuous and as a pro-Southern Northerner. Yes, he was from New Hampshire, the only president from New Hampshire, but he was pro-South. He was acceptable to the slavery wing of the Democratic Party. The platform came out emphatically for the finality of the Compromise of 1850, fugitive slave law and all. The Whig convention should have logically nominated their president, Millard Fillmore, but having won in the past with military heroes, they turned to another. Old Fuss and Feathers, Winfield S. Scott, perhaps one of the ablest generals of his generation. His personality, unfortunately, eclipsed and repelled the masses and eclipsed his genuinely statesmanlike achievements. He would have made a good president, quite likely, but his personality was not warm and fuzzy. The campaign again degenerated into a dull and childish attack on personalities. Democrats ridiculed Scott's pomposity, while Whigs charged that Pierce was the hero of many a well-fought battle. Yes, Pierce did suffer from alcoholism, and he will die from cirrhosis of the liver. And he was known as the fainting general. Now, I had mentioned that to you when we were discussing the Mexican-American War, that he had been thrown from his horse and suffered a terrible groin injury. That was not why he was the fainting general. Yes, when he tried to get on his horse the next day, he fainted with pain. But from that point on, he was known as the fainting general, and because of alcoholism. Yes, he did have trouble with alcoholism, but not why the situation occurred during the Mexican-American War. But every cartoon during the campaign will refer to his fainting. Here, the opposition, the Democrats, the Whigs, once again running a military hero, Scott. They have him on the Gamecock, and they have Pierce on the Goose. And Scott says, "What's the matter, Pierce? Feel faint? Ha, ha, ha." And he makes some fun of his goose. And they have Pierce saying, "Oh, dear me, I shall faint. I know I shall faint. It's constitutional." And once again, they run the military man. Oh, Fuss and Feathers. He was known for his resplendent uniforms. And Scott with his candidate, vice presidential candidate. Pierce with his vice presidential candidate. And Pierce with his, another campaign poster, Pierce with his candidate, and the Capitol and the White House. Yes, we are going to Washington, D.C. And another smear at the candidate. They are making fun of the social qualities of our candidate. And I read this earlier, but basically, yes, making fun of this candidate, and he's drunk, but he's saying, oh, I am standing here holding up this tree, and he's got his bottle in his hand, and I don't know what was going on at the time, but something to do with the Maine liquor law. But once again, when you get 160, 80 years away from the issue, it grows dim. And here you have Scott and his uniform, and somehow Daniel Webster is in there in this foot race for the Union, and there is Pierce, once again, military man as well, Mexican-American War, and Daniel Webster in this all-out race for the White House. He was not a candidate, but somehow in there. Ooh, a little bit nasty, the contested seat. This one, electorally, was not even close, but popular-wise was a rather close election. Here you have Scott trying to pull the presidential chair out from under Pierce, and he says, sorry to disappoint you, Pierce, but the people wish me to take this chair. And Pierce says, look out there. What you about, General? Do you want to knock a feller's brains out? And of course, you can't beat this one. We poked 'em in 44, we'll pierce 'em in 52. Democratic campaign slogan. Poked 'em. Polk was elected in 44, Pierce to be elected by the Democrats in 52. Luckily for the Democrats, the Whig Party was hopelessly split, and the pliant Pierce wins in a landslide. Come on, let's go. There we go. And Hale wins no electoral votes, but he does take 5% of the popular vote. But once again, no electoral. Now, popular vote, almost half and half. Pierce wins 51%, but dang, come on. In the electoral vote, which is where you actually win, it is a landslide, 86% to 14%, 254 to 42. At the time of his election, Pierce, at 47, was the youngest man to ever be elected. Now, that election record will be beaten. He will not be the youngest man. Teddy Roosevelt will beat that record, and then after him, it will be Kennedy will beat that record. But at this point, Franklin Pierce at 47 will be the youngest man to be elected. Go back to Pierce. At the outset, the Pierce administration displayed vigor. The new president standing confidently before some 15... Oh, come on. before some 15,000 people on Inauguration Day delivered from memory a clear-voiced inaugural address. Can you imagine on such an important day not having notes before you, reading your notes? No, this man had his speech memorized. That is an accomplishment. His cabinet contained aggressive Southerners, including as his Secretary of War, one Jefferson Davis, who would become future President of the Confederacy. So yes, he's from New Hampshire. He's a Northerner, but he's pro-Southern, which is how he gets elected. As a Democrat, you need to bring in the Southern vote as well as the Northern vote. And he said, I am pro-South. I am going to enforce all aspects of the Compromise of 1850, fugitive slave law and all. Jefferson Davis will do an excellent job as Secretary of War. He will modernize the U.S. military. He will promote based on competency and ability rather than pull or position. He will really whip the U.S. military into shape. I have a feeling that he will regret that he was such a good Secretary of War, because a few years later, when he will become President of the Confederacy, he is not dealing with an outdated Union military. No, he will be dealing with an updated Union military that he helped update. And Cuba, the coveted pearl of the Antilles. Sugar-rich Cuba, right here, lying right off the southern border of the United States, right off of Florida, was a prime objective of Manifest Destiny in the 1850s. Supporting a large population of enslaved blacks, it was coveted by the South as the most desirable slave territory available. Carved into several states, it could once more restore the political balance in the Senate. Remember, when we added California, we went in the Senate from 15 to 16 free, still only 15 states slave. And it does not look like any of the territory left in the United States is really desirable for slavery. Well, come on. The island of Cuba already has slavery, and it has a large enough population, not a huge area, but by population, it can be divided into several states. Remember, you can't be admitted as a state until you have X number of people living there. And because of its large population already, it could be carved into several states where, because of its moist climate, sugar growing, rice growing, labor-intensive crops, with its large black population already in place, it could be created into numerous slave states. Polk the expansionist had already taken steps to offer $100 million to Spain for it. But the sensitive Spaniards had replied that they would rather see it sunk into the ocean before they would sell it to America at any price. Now, under the Pierce administration, the Austin Manifesto was written up. This startling document urged that the administration now offer $120 million for Cuba. And if Spain refused, and if her continued ownership endangered American interests, the U.S. would be justified in wresting, that means forcibly taking, the island from her. This secret Austin Manifesto quickly leaked out. Northern free soilers, already angered by the fugitive slave law and other gains for slavery, rose in an outburst of wrath against the manifesto. Confronted with disruption at home, the red-faced Pierce administration was forced to drop its brazen schemes for Cuba. With the newly acquired land on the Pacific coast, feasible land transportation was imperative, or the newly won possessions might break away. You had the Oregon Territory that had been won. California had been settled, bam, in 1 year's time. We had the population out there because of the gold rush. And then we had this great American desert in between. We needed a way to get from the rest of the United States to this part of the United States more quickly. It's, dang, these wires. Hang on, I've got to move my wires. As you can see, we figured out a solution briefly. Not a long-term solution here. Otherwise, it was felt this section could say, we don't need, hey, come on, this rest of the United States. Camels, now we get to the camels, were even proposed as the answer. Several score, remember we've already discussed this score business. Score is 20, several score. So we got 40, about 60 camels were even brought over from the Middle East. These temperamental beasts known as ships of the desert were brought over, but mule-driving Americans did not adjust well to these spitting animals. A transcontinental railroad was clearly the only real solution to the problem. The best railroad route, though, lay slightly south of the Mexican border, and Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, a Mississippian, arranged to have James Gadsden, a prominent South Carolinian, a railroad man, appointed as minister to Mexico. How did we get back to the camel? Now, if you want to put a railroad through, who would be better suited to help you in that endeavor with Mexico other than a railroad man? Now, is a railroad man going to be a good minister to Mexico? Maybe, maybe not. Finding Santa Anna in power for the 11th and last time. I think maybe once earlier in one of the lectures I said he came in and out of power 6 times. That was wrong. He came in and out of Mexican power 11 times. And the United States as a nation has benefited greatly from his being in power because we acquired half of Mexico while Santa Anna was in power in Mexico. And as usual, Santa Anna was in need of money. Gadsden made gratifying headway. And a treaty is worked out in 1853, which cedes to the United States the Gadsden Purchase for a total of $10 million. We even have a stamp in the United States on most likely the 100th anniversary of the Gadsden Purchase. A chunk of desert down here. We paid $15 million for the Mexican cession, this massive chunk of land, which included that beautiful California and the Golden Gate of San Francisco. And yet we paid $10 million for this hunk of desert. Oh, how times have changed. Who ever heard of paying $10 million for this and, I'm sorry, $15 million for this and $10 million for this? Well, it all depends what you want it for. The southern route of a transcontinental railroad, Gadsden concluded, the best lay of the land went through a piece of Mexico. You don't want to go over mountains. You want to go through valleys. You want to find the lay of the land that has the least opposition. And it went through a section of Mexico. You don't run your railroad through someone else's country. You got to stop at the border. You got to do this. You got to do that. How are you going to be able to maintain your railroad when it's in someone else's territory? Yada, yada, yada. So we will buy this chunk of desert so that we can keep our railroad in the United States. That will be the last that Santa Anna will be ruler in Mexico. From that time on, the Mexican people have had enough of him. What are you going to do? Every time you need money, sell off another chunk of our country. And so he will no longer be president of Mexico. Northern railroad boosters quickly replied that if organized territory was the test, then Nebraska should be organized. At this point in 1854, Senator Stephen A. Douglas, known as the Little Giant, he stood only 5'4", but he was a powerful politician. He is from Illinois. Illinois. We will later have Abraham Lincoln from Illinois, and the two, the Little Giant and the huge Abraham Lincoln, will be major contesters for the seat in the Senate for Illinois, and later major contesters for the presidential election in 1860. So the two candidates, the Little Giant and Lincoln, will come up against each other. As a counterstroke to offset the Gadsden thrust for southern expansion westward, the proposed territory of Nebraska would be carved into two territories, Kansas and Nebraska. Where's my map? So he's from Illinois, and he says, oh, you want to put a southern transcontinental railroad through? I want to benefit my state, which is in the middle. So he says, let's take this massive area that is left of the Louisiana Purchase, and let's create it into two territories, Kansas and Nebraska. Well, as we know, Nebraska will later get carved into multiple areas. We'll have Nebraska, and we'll have North and South Dakota and other stuff as well. But he says, then from Illinois, we can run a railroad through the center of the country. And that will, of course, benefit my state, because cargo from this part, the center of the country, coming through my state, will go out to the West Coast. So let's open up this territory to expansion and hopefully keep the South from putting their railroad through. So these two new territories being created, their status regarding slavery would be settled by popular sovereignty. So is this going to be an easy decide in Congress whether this is going to be free territory or slave territory? No, but I want it opened up quickly so that my state can benefit by putting a because we can't wait, or the southern route is going to be put through. So let's get this area settled fast so that we can put the railroad through, because a railroad doesn't want to go through territory where no people live, because that's very expensive to put railroad through territory where no people live. But if people live here, then it's worthwhile, because as my railroad goes through area where people live, there's going to be stops for my railroad all through this area where people live. Goods are going to get taken off. Goods are going to get put on. I'm going to get paid for goods being put on my train. Passengers are going to get on. I'm going to get paid for people on. I'm going to get a lot of money for my railroad going through populated territory. I don't get paid for my railroad going through territory where nobody lives. And so to encourage railroad people to go and put a railroad through the center of the nation, we've got to get it settled. So, Stephen A. Douglas, how quickly can we get this area settled? If we wait for Congress to decide free or slave, it's going to take forever. So, what can I do to get it settled fast? Let me put bait out there. A good bait is, hey, let's open it up to the people. So you Southerners, if you can get enough people up into Kansas first and vote it as a slave territory, hey, you can reduce that 1516 to 1616. You free people don't want another slave state. You quickly get your free people into Kansas and vote for a free state, then you can solve that problem. So both sides are going to be, of course, rushing people into Kansas. Therefore, Kansas will have enough people to ask for admittance as a state, and we will have one more area with people in it to induce the railroad to come through. But the problem is the Missouri Compromise. He says, let's open it up to popular sovereignty. Remember the Compromise of 1820, the Missouri Compromise? Maine comes in a free state, Missouri comes in a slave state, but the southern boundary of Missouri is as far as slavery will go in the Louisiana Purchase. And they had said, fine, this is not really conducive to slavery because the dryness, labor-intensive crops aren't grown here. So you will not have slavery extension into the rest of the Louisiana Purchase. Now he suddenly says, no, let's open it up to popular sovereignty. Not according to the Missouri Compromise. So you got to either nullify the Missouri Compromise or you cannot have popular sovereignty in this territory. Many Southerners who had never conceived of the Kansas territory as slave soil now rise to the bait. The pliable President Pierce, under the thumb of Southern advisors, now threw his full weight behind the Kansas-Nebraska bill. All fury would now break out. Both sides would rush settlers into Kansas, causing the blood to be shed. Thus the term Bleeding Kansas. And it does turn into one horrible mess. The blood does shed in Kansas. Both sides, and this is not a black and white situation. This is whites killing whites over the issue of slavery. This is where John Brown will first gain his notoriety. He is an ardent anti-slavery man, and he will fight in raids against the slaveryites in Kansas. Here, they will set fire to the opposing sides. It gets nasty. Another artist's conception of the burning and fighting and bleeding in Kansas. The drunken pro-slavery mob going to sack Lawrence, Kansas. And a poster announcing an anti-slavery meeting. Kansas, a free state. Squatter sovereignty vindicated. No white slavery. The squatters of Kansas are a favorable to freedom of speech and our subjects, which, mass meeting. So come to this meeting if you don't want slavery in Kansas. And as I mentioned, John Brown gains his notoriety there, which ultimately leads to his attack on Harper's Ferry at the time of the Civil War, which is an armory, a place where they make military weapons, and a key place down in Virginia on the river, key location, strategic location. He, of course, does not have the uprising that he thought would come to his aid or come and get weapons. It very soon caves in the whole raid, and he is executed. Franklin Pierce, one of the few men who so never wanted to be president in his life, and his wife so never wanted to be first lady. They had 3 sons, and 2 had already died. The third, this poor woman, the third son dies in a horrible train accident while they are on their way to Washington, D.C. Can you imagine anything so horrible happening as your son dies on your way to take your position as President of the United States? He already knew he didn't want to be. He didn't campaign. He wouldn't do anything to help get into the White House. Well, from this point on, she hated everything to do with the White House. And she would only wear black. She was in mourning the whole 4 years. And she went a little bit off mentally. She had just suffered too much loss. For your question to answer for today's attendance, it's not going to be in the lecture. I want you to go and online figure out how did her son, and don't tell me he died in a railroad accident. Give me a little bit more detail than that. How did their third son die when they were on their way to Washington, D.C., right before their very eyes? Can you imagine having to watch your child die and you can't do a thing about it to have helped him out? So please find out for your answer, for attendance, for today's lectures. How did their third son pass away? And a picture of her and their son Benjamin Pierce. Oops. Known for his shock of wild hair up there. And yes, from the Mexican-American War, he was also a military man. But he did not, after that, spend years in the military like some of the others did. Sorry, the background on some of these pictures is so dark, and the fact that I have a black background makes it hard to see where the picture starts and the background starts. And the Pierces, you wanted to know this someday on Jeopardy! They placed the first Christmas tree in the White House. Yaha! And back then, they actually put candles on the tree. And so this would have been lit only for like an hour and been watched very carefully, and then all the candles would have been blown out. New Hampshire, their house. Back, if you ever go up into New England area, up into New Hampshire, Vermont, the architecture is very different. The stables, what we would now consider like a garage and everything, are connected to the house. Winters so harsh there, and the blowing winds and whatnot, that you did not want to have to walk across the yard to get to the stables and things. And so your barns, your stables are connected to your houses. You might actually get lost and not make it back to the house. Sometimes weather could be so fierce. So you could walk out of your house directly into the barn to check on the animals and back into your house. And his grave marker, here they've got them all on one. Here is his wife, two of his sons. I am assuming that maybe the other son is on the backside because they had 3 sons. So, but yet here we have Frank Pierce and Benjamin Pierce, yet they had 3 sons. So I'm not quite sure why the third is not listed. And yet all 3 had died by the time they entered the White House. So I am assuming maybe on the other side, the third son is listed. Otherwise, I have no idea, unless if he died so young right at birth or something. And foreign. We have 2 stamps of Pierce. He is rather one of our lackluster presidents. He didn't want to be president. He was not dominant with Congress. He just was sort of there in the years before the Civil War. Not a vigorous, influential president at all. He just, like I said, was sort of there. Thus ends Franklin Pierce, and we will break off once again for now.